Hello, everyone. Today we are going to talk about a very interesting topic, one that I've had some interest in over the years, UFOs. There's been a lot of talk about this in the news recently and talking about the government involved in it. And so I'd like to bring on a guest who has studied this in depth, and he has a new book on the topic. Jonathan Kendall. Dr. Jonathan Kendall, welcome.
Thanks, Mike, for having me again. I appreciate it.
Yeah, my pleasure, brother. Hey, Jonathan is one of our board members. He's been on the board for several years. I met Jonathan when he was in medical school. We went out and had dinner. It was up in, I was speaking in Kentucky, and we got together.
Cool.
And didn't we go to a Thai restaurant?
We did.
Yeah, I think it was the first time, maybe the first or second time I ever had sticky rice. Man, that stuff is good.
Delicious. I could not agree more.
So Jonathan is board certified medical doctor. He's board certified in internal medicine and in nephrology. And right now he is practicing nephrology in Eastern Kentucky. Jonathan, tell us, what is nephrology?
Essentially the study of kidney disease. We're probably most well known for doing dialysis. So if you know somebody that's on dialysis, we would be the main doctors behind that. We also do a lot of other things like hypertension, that's high blood pressure, electrolyte disorders.
Okay, cool. More about Jonathan here. Last year, was it July? He came out with a book, Seeing the Messiah. And what this book does, it's an excellent book. And what this book does is compare the post-resurrection appearances of Jesus with reports of people seeing the dead, what you might call apparitions. So this is a pretty neat thing. He's done a lot of research with this, good research. He's very careful. He doesn't go further than what the evidence can bear. I really like your caution, your prudence in which you work through that book. Well, now he's coming out next month. This is June. Today is June 11th. And next month, he's coming out with a book, The Metaphysics of UFOs, Evidential Case Studies of UAPs, Paranormal Phenomena, and Spiritual Encounters. So they gave you a pre-published copy. It looks good. So yeah, it's definitely bigger than what this picture is.
They did. I think my wife's about maybe 3/4 of the way through it. I told her I had to borrow the copy today because I wanted to bring it to show. I didn't know you'd have it printed out there, but looks like you were prepared ahead of me anyway.
So before you think this thing about UFOs is crazy, everyone, I want to read to you one of the endorsements for this book. This is by Dale Allison, who teaches New Testament at Princeton Seminary, one of the top New Testament scholars in the world. By no means a conservative. And here's what he says about Jonathan's book. If all reported encounters with UFOs, UAPs were the product of deception or misperception, we wouldn't have a problem. But that just isn't the case. So we have a problem, a big one. If you want to know just how big, read Kendall. He presents the cases even-handedly, analyzes them critically, and then stands back to ask how we might put it all together, occupying the space between wanna believe credulity and bar none skepticism. The metaphysics of UFOs will force you to think hard, will compel you to contemplate possible impossibilities. That's from Dale Allison. That's pretty good
Nice
endorsement.
Very appreciative.
So I got some questions for you, man. What initially prompted you to have an interest in UFOs?
You know, Mike, that's an interesting question because I don't even hardly recall, at least the last few years, why I ended up writing about it. I think trying to remember back, I had started this research for the apparitions book around 2020. And sometime around 2022, in my basic research for that, I ran across an interesting topic called Men in Black that were associated with the UFO phenomenon.
Yeah,
so
just
I
like
started
the movie,
studying
right?
that. Yeah. Well, the Men in Black phenomenon is very different from the Tommy Lee Jones, Will Smith movies. although most people know it from, I think, from the movies, know that concept. But I started studying that because I thought, well, maybe that's an apparitional subject. And that led into the wider UFO phenomenon. And I had essentially started writing this book at about this. Maybe I had a couple years head start on Seeing the Messiah, but I was essentially writing both of these books at the same time. And I know you had obviously been very instrumental in helping to guide me in terms of separating the material and trying two different books. And I think that ended up being a wise decision. But as far as my overall interest, I grew up in Cross Lanes, West Virginia initially. My mom, my uncle, they had grown up, and when there was a big UFO flap going on where they lived, they would go out sometimes and actually look for UFOs at night. Somehow I was always interested in the subject. I remember when I was in grade school, I did a 1-page report on the material, and I don't know whatever happened to that, but while everyone else was doing mundane topics, I decided to do a report on UFOs for school. So for whatever reason, I've always been interested in the world of the paranormal.
That's pretty cool. I remember when I was a teenager, I don't know, early to mid-teens, I would suppose, I had an interest in UFOs as well. I wanted to see one. There were sightings of it. This was back in the 70s, and I thought that'd be pretty cool. So, yeah. Well, now another name for UFOs is UAPs, Unidentified Aerial Phenomena. Why was the name changed?
I think it was an attempt to try to remove the stigma associated with UFOs, because it became eventually a subject that people don't take seriously. I think in recent years, there's been a lot to try to remove the stigma, even if it still exists. And I think that was just essentially a rebranding. I tried to figure out if there was one person. I know I was told by one very prominent ufologist in private correspondence that it was rebranded by a single person, but I couldn't find any confirmation of that in the literature. But I think unidentified aerial phenomena, technically UAP is unidentified anomalous phenomena, which for me that could be anything. It doesn't even have to be something flying through the air, but that you can trace that acronym UAP back to the 1960s. But I think the reason it took on more prominence lately was in an attempt for destigmatization.
Okay. Now we've heard reports, even from senators, congressmen, that the U.S. government has confirmed the existence of UFOs. What do you know about that?
That's a complicated question. I would say from the top down, the government probably hasn't given us much. I do know recently, I think at the president's behest, you've got all these videos that's been released lately. Now, if you watch some of those videos, they're all on thermal imaging. I don't think it's the kind of stuff yet that's going to change anybody's mind. The people that are believers are still going to be believers, and those that are skeptics are going to remain skeptical. But yeah, you mentioned in an era where almost nothing is bipartisan, at least nothing that actually makes the news, there is significant bipartisan support for taking UFOs seriously and just UFO disclosure in general. So the idea is that I guess it's something almost conspiratorial. You've got these whistleblowers that's come out of the woodworks, like David Grush being the most prominent one. You've got a few others. They've testified before Congress that not only do UFOs exist, but there's actually crash retrievals, that the government actually has UFOs in its possession in some sense, and that there are these legacy programs or special access programs where defense contracting companies, some of the big names that most people will have heard of, are trying to use these exotic materials in an attempt at reverse engineering. And you've got, I don't think any, from what I can tell, no congressman or congresswoman or senator really seems to know, but there are a number that are taking it seriously. So, for instance, on the Democratic side, you got Chuck Schumer, who was a Senate Majority Leader. His predecessor, Harry Reid, he was the one that put UFOs essentially back on the map in terms of trying to get it respectability. It was largely through his efforts and a couple other senators that $22 million was given for a program called OSAP back in 2008 through 2010. So the government has been researching this. On the Republican side, you've got Marco Rubio, our current Secretary of State. You've got, and then what's interesting, Mike, I mentioned that there's been 3 congressional meetings or assemblies on this where people have testified. But the more interesting thing beyond that are the SCIFs, the sensitive compartmented information facilities. I think I got that right. Where people are taken into spy-proof rooms, and this information, unfortunately, is not made public. And I can tell you, Congressman from Tennessee, Tim Burchett, said that there are things that will keep people up at night if it were to become public. And interestingly enough, for our purposes, Anna Paulina Luna, who's a congresswoman out of Florida, she keeps saying in connection to this, read the book of 1 Enoch. Read the book of 1 Enoch. She just says that cryptically. And she has said on the Joe Rogan podcast that this is some kind of interdimensional phenomenon, that whatever these entities are, that they hail from some parallel reality.
So First Enoch, the book of First Enoch, is a non-canonical book. It was written, well, it's disputed when it was written. Some scholars would say parts of it, perhaps most of it, was written in the 1st century BC or the early 1st century. And then later on, an editor came in and added the rest, perhaps at the latter part of the 1st century. First Enoch is quoted in the letter of Jude. So that's kind of interesting. So do you believe the U.S. government, do you think they have a flying saucer in its possession, or any other governments? Do you think any of them have this?
I actually do. And for reasons we'll maybe get into later, I was very resistant to this possibility before. I can tell you, Mike, there's a lot of smoke. There's no actual fire. And there's been people since at least the 80s make this claim, or I guess really since the 40s, if you go back to the alleged Roswell crash. But what convinces me that there's probably greater, at least in my mind, greater than 50% confidence that we have one, is Jim Lukatsky, who was essentially one of the heads of OSAP, the head. He wrote a series of books that had to go through the DOPSR program, and it essentially had to get government approval before the Pentagon would release it. His first books he co-authored with George Knapp, who's a journalist out of Las Vegas, and Colin Kelleher, who's essentially a biochemist. They wrote a book called Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, and they've had 3 others released since then. The second book in the series is called Initial Revelations. And in chapter 9, at the start of that chapter in that book, Initial Revelations, it talks about how he was in with a meeting with a senator, an unnamed one, then I think an undersecretary. And he said, you have a UFO in your possession that you've actually breached the hull. You have no idea how it works, how the propulsion mechanism. There's no evident fuel. There's no evident fuel containment system. So they don't know much about it. But to me, that suggests to me that, along with some of the other evidence that's out there, that they probably do have a craft, as crazy as that might seem.
Why all the secrecy? Why do you think the government just doesn't disclose all the information they have about UFO? I mean, I guess I could understand if they're trying to reverse engineer it. That would give us, certainly give you a leg up in the technology. Huge, potentially unbelievably huge.
Right.
But why all the secrecy?
I think national security. Okay. I think the idea is that the United States isn't the only country that's gotten these exotic materials. Other countries have as well, and it's almost like a new arms race.
Okay.
Like Los Alamos, the first one to the nuclear bomb. And if you understand essentially the observables behind UFOs, And this goes back, very similar things were observed with these things going all the way back into the 1940s when UFOs first became within the public consciousness. It suggests a very highly advanced technology. And in essence, the first one to crack that code, the first one to crack that technology could rule the world. It could be even bigger than the atomic bomb potentially. And I suspect that is what's going on here.
What's your favorite UFO case?
My favorite, I think it kind of goes to what we had just said before about national security. There was a first lieutenant named Bob Jacobs back in 1964. He was in charge of seeing test ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles, being launched outside of Vandenberg Air Force Base, Big Sur, California. And one time there was a dummy nuclear warhead that he was tracking on video. And suddenly he saw a dome, like a flying saucer, while the thing was in orbit or en route. 4 laser beams were fired at the dummy nuclear warhead, and it fell from orbit. It knocked it totally off its trajectory. So, and of course, at first we just had, he claims afterwards that he was taken into the office. That video was replayed. There were others present, including people from the CIA as well as the Air Force. They said, don't say anything about this to anybody. Keep it secret. This was back in '64. Well, Jacobs maintained his story all the way up until this day. I just read a 2019 book from him where he still confirms it, more than, half a century later. Well, also, later on, Florence Mansman, who was also present, he was the major involved. He came out and said that Jacob's story is true. So you've got 2 trained observers who were able to watch this on video. In fact, they watched it on high-resolution imaging, slow motion, and they could say that not only was it a saucer-shaped craft, but there was a dome on top of it, on top of the saucer, in essence. And that they were able to watch those effectively laser beams hit this missile and knock it out of the sky. I think that's my favorite. It's not the most evidential case in the world. We don't have any declassified documents that confirm it, but you do have 2 trained observers that claim to have seen this and were able to watch that video multiple times. And they've not retracted their story. And what I think is interesting about this story, one thing is that it really just adds to the mystery. What was the point? Let's assume that that's an authentic case. What was the purpose behind it all? Was this UFO or whatever the intelligence was behind it trying to send a message? Be careful with your nukes. I think that's why I find it so interesting, the mystery behind it.
Okay. What is the scariest or most disturbing UFO case of which you're aware?
That would be, but there would be one of 2 I would choose for that. I think the one that wins out for me is the one I talk about in my book, the first chapter on the abductions. 3 ladies were out for a birthday meal in Kentucky, which is right in my backyard, Casey County. They were coming home late at night, dark, desolate road. Suddenly, a UFO craft with blue and red lights, saucer-shaped about the size of a football field, they encountered along the way. It circled around them. The car, there were disturbances as if it just took absolute control of the car. The ladies were panicking. Well, suddenly they remember being close to being back home. And they got home about an hour and 20 minutes later than they should have. Didn't remember a thing. When they got back home, they just were very thirsty. They had to go in and just pour water from the faucet and drink a lot of fluid. They noticed the next day that there were burns on their neck, different parts of their bodies, as if they had been affected by whatever this was for whatever reason. I think they phoned it was a local police office. They waited till the day after. The police said, well, there's not really much I can do about it now. But they did report this to other authorities. And eventually the UFO community got involved. and they submitted to hypnosis. So this was in 1976, by the way, but they were submitted to hypnosis, and they independently they were had these hypnotic regressions, and they remember being inside the craft, actually abducted. They felt like they were what took place inside was just very disturbing. One lady describes this burning fluid being just poured all over her face. One of the ladies said it was like being inside of a volcano. And they had all these after it was all said and done, they had all these disturbing after effects. Like one of the ladies, Louise Smith, she had this compulsion to go back to that site where they saw the UFO. This was later. And she felt something brush against her hand, and suddenly her jewelry was gone. And when she was there, she was just frozen in place. She couldn't remember having any other experiences, but it was very frightening to her. She got back home within a day or two. Two of the three pieces of jewelry that were taken off her hands were laying outside of her door for whatever reason.
Wow.
Yeah. And I think this is an interesting case because these were three ladies. They were, for what it's worth, polygraph tests generally aren't that reliable, but they did submit to polygraph tests. They all passed. They were pillars of their community, pillars of the local church. So I believe they were telling the truth. And one of the ladies died soon after. Her parakeet, she had a pet parakeet that would never act the same around her again, and it died not too long afterwards. They all had these paranormal fallouts. One of the other ladies, Mona Stafford, she one time saw an apparition of what she called a biblical character, something she might see in a biblical image. That I think, given what the painful, just kind of hellish nature of the experience is why I find that so disturbing. That would probably be it.
Interesting. You've told me before about some miraculous healings with UFO cases. I mean, that's one where harm was inflicted upon them, I suppose you could say. But what about healings?
So there was one written about in a book by Artie Six Killer Clark. She was interested in the UFO phenomenon. The name of her book, I believe, is Sky People. And she went through Mexico, Central America, different places. She was following these famous explorers' routes, but on the way, she was collecting all these UFO stories, going and interviewing firsthand witnesses. So one of the people she interviewed was named Salvador, and he had reported his story of a miraculous healing. He was on his deathbed. The doctors had said, "You've got essentially end-stage lung cancer. That's it." And so he prayed fervently. The priest had visited, and he was just going to lay there to die in his bed. And he prayed to Jesus, "Please, Lord, heal me." Well, oddly enough, these glowing orbs entered his house one night, surrounded him. One went over the length of his body, stopped at the head. I believe there were 4 or 5 of them. And then they exited his house. Well, suddenly he felt a lot better. He had the energy to get out and walk outside to follow these orbs. And he saw them ascend into a beam of light over a big tree in his yard. And there was a V-shaped UFO that these orbs disappeared into, and then the UFO took off. Well, he knew immediately that he was healed because he felt so much better. He wouldn't have even had the energy to go outside before. And he got new medical testing and said, yeah, everything came back cleared. So he was healed, supposedly, of metastatic cancer. And his wife attested to that as well when Clark interviewed him. So I find that case very interesting. I think I find it interesting, Mike, more than anything, as Christians, we're used to praying for healing for us or for others. And usually we would expect not necessarily to see anything. If it's going to occur, we would think it's probably going to just happen. Or maybe we would expect to see a vision of Jesus or the Blessed Virgin Mary or an angel. You certainly wouldn't expect to see UFOs. So that's what I find ironic about that case.
That is interesting. Are there any Like how many examples did you read about people being harmed by the aliens and the UFOs?
There was a document that's actually available online by John Schuessler where he talks about scores of such cases. And it seems as if those that were harmed, the injuries seem to be indicative of radiation poisoning, either non-ionizing or ionizing radiation. A lot of people that have these experiences will get red eyes, conjunctivitis, that's inflamed, watery eyes afterwards. That's usually self-limiting and goes away. Nausea, vomiting, insomnia, psychological after effects like PTSD effects, those kinds of things. You see that come up a lot in the literature, even if it's not in an alleged abduction case. Jacques Vallée, who's arguably the most well-known ufologist in the world, in one of his recent publications, he says that there are more than 900 such cases of harm inflicted by UFOs in the literature.
Wow. What's the are there a lot more that talk about harm than good?
It seems to be a mixed bag, to be honest with you, Mike. I think there might be more good than harm, if I had to guess.
Okay.
Preston Dennett, he's a ufologist. He wrote a couple versions of a book. The most recent one where he talks about he has 300 cases of healings within a UFO context, whether it's abduction or just an ordinary close encounter. Now, the evidential quality of those vary, of course. Some of them are better than others, but I would guess there's more healing. I don't know an exact number because obviously you've got hundreds of reported cases of both. But if I had to make an educated guess, I'd say more of the healing variety.
Okay. Well, now I want to transition slightly to some things that many will regard as questionable. You provide evidence of a connection between UFOs and some other phenomena such as poltergeists, hauntings, mysterious orbs, cattle mutilations, ghosts, a few other things. What do you make of this connection, and how does this influence your interpretation of UFOs?
I think, Mike, this connection makes me lean, although, and maybe we'll get into this more, while I think the extraterrestrial hypothesis, which is what most people think of when they think of aliens and UFOs, if they come from somewhere else in our galaxy or even outside of our galaxy. They come from somewhere within our home universe. It's that phenomenon that you just mentioned that makes me lean more towards this being an interdimensional phenomenon or with some kind of occult overtones. I think the fact that these run together, and there are these UFO flap areas, Point Pleasant, West Virginia, back in the late 1960s, Dawson, New Mexico, Northeast Utah, the Hudson Valley up in New York State, a number of others. They seem to run together, and people that experience one frequently will see cryptids, like Sasquatch-like entities, or maybe in the case of Point Pleasant, the Mothman. They'll have these men in black visitations, and in the aftermath, there will be, usually for a limited time, these poltergeist activities in their house. They'll wake up to have shadowy, like these sometimes shadowy creatures standing over their bed, just really creepy things.
You know, there are two kinds of people in this world. Those who subscribe to my YouTube channel, winners, good people, and those dirtbags who don't. Which one are you?
I know the sighting of UFOs go back a long time. From what I've heard, like if you went back 100 or 200 years or more, a UFO looked very different than a flying saucer. Could look like maybe a ship that's flying, one of those ships with sails or something kind of weird. And so some have made the case that as we have developed greater technology in flying, that the shape of UFOs has also been updated, which would seem to suggest that they're not authentic sightings. What do you make of that?
When you say authentic, do you mean hallucinatory or?
Yeah, or they were
What do you
just
mean by
made
that?
up, perhaps, invented.
Oh, I see.
I guess that wouldn't account for the good stuff that's around, the
Well,
well evidence cases.
it's fun. I'll answer that two ways. If you go back to 1897, you've got all these mysterious airship sightings, many of which were hoaxes. I think thanks to the work of Jerome Clark and others, though, there seems to be a legitimate basis to the phenomenon. And you're right, they'd be airships. And this would occur, several years before Kitty Hawk, right, where you had the first flight. And you'd have these oblong craft that would have wings and that would have a big spotlight in front, and they would hover over these cities. I think it started in California. I want to say San Francisco, but it was one of the California cities. And then there were all these sightings in the Midwest, and there are all these old newspaper articles that report that. Some of those cases are authentic. I think more likely than not, I think there's a there. Some of them are hoaxes. And then these craft would just be seen after a certain time. They would just take off, as just at the velocity would be so fast. It's like they were there 1 second and gone the next. And then as technology improves, when you get in the 1940s, you start seeing UFOs, you start seeing flying saucers. They also have other shapes like cigar-shaped craft. You eventually get into the triangular-shaped craft. You got the orbs. 1942, both Allied and German bombers, their aircraft would be trailed by these red orbs. There were over 100 cases of them. They called them Foo Fighters. 1946 in Holland, you had ghost rockets. And a lot of people thought, well, the Soviets, they're pulling some shenanigans here in the aftermath of World War II. They're testing these rockets in Nordic countries. And there seems to be some evidence based on that. You've got a lot of very strong the evidence for those other things, rather than just the overall UAP evidence, what I call the modern day flying saucer evidence. It's a lot of it's more anecdotal, but you do have enough that goes back to eyewitness testimony, enough good sightings to make me think that there probably were some authentic ones. When you come to the UFOs, though, one thing I like to cite, Project Blue Book. That was the government's big study of UFOs that took place from 1952 to 1969, or 1951 to 1969. They ended up at the end of the day saying that UFOs don't constitute a threat to national security. We really shouldn't be studying them. However, even according to the most conservative estimates, and I think it was too conservative, if anything, there were well over 500 unknown cases. There were actually 701, I think, at the start. But one of the last heads of Blue Book, Hector Quintanilla, which he was a little on the skeptical side. He tried to pare that down to 530 some. And when I say that these were unknowns or unidentified, these are cases that had very solid evidence, usually trained observers, more than one observer, evidence collected from eyewitnesses that seemed to be legitimate from different angles, independent of one another. A lot of times these were corroborated with radar. Sometimes they were corroborated with pictures. So these were cases that had good enough data. If the data just wasn't good, like let's suppose I report a UFO and I say, well, I just saw this light in the distance. It was there 1 second, and then it just vanished over a distant tree line. And my wife, who was driving the car, she didn't see it. Let's say I reported that. Well, they would call that insufficient data. They wouldn't call that an unknown because there's just not enough data. Even if they think I'm telling the truth, there's just not enough data there. And rightfully so, I don't think you would call that a UFO. So one of the earlier, less skeptical heads of Blue Book, Edwin Ruppel, he makes an argument in his book, his 1956 book on the subject, that when you look at these cases, even one or two or three cases, you make a good argument that these are true UFOs, unidentified, essentially UFOs by definition. But you've got hundreds of them. So the chances that all of these have prosaic explanations, even up in the 1950s, quickly approaches zero.
Now, I suppose that just like near-death experiences, some near-death experiences can be explained via medical or psychological explanations, but not the ones that have corroborating data. And I'm wondering about alien abductions. I'm sure, you as a physician, you look at some of these reports and you say, well, that could have a very plausible medical or psychological explanation for what they're reporting, but not all of them would.
Yes.
You got anything to say about that?
Yeah, in modern times, I'm talking probably from the 1990s and beyond, when maybe even before that to some extent, when the UFO abduction became kind of, again, part of the public consciousness, pop culture. They were making movies about it and so forth. I would guess that the vast majority of reported abductions have some kind of prosaic explanation, like a psychiatric abnormality, or especially sleep paralysis. Sleep paralysis is a condition that affects up to 25% of the world, essentially, has one episode of this. You wake up in your bed and you're totally paralyzed. In essence, at least your skeletal muscles, the muscles responsible for movement, are paralyzed. And it's sometimes you'll have a hallucination of a shadowy entity approaching. Sometimes it'll sit on your chest. I think everyone, if you haven't experienced that, you probably know somebody that's experienced it. And that's a situation in which you're literally half asleep, half awake. You're still in an REM state of sleep. And the reason you can't move is because your neurotransmitters that inhibit movement are still strong, because you haven't fully awakened yet. And you can see your surroundings, but you've got dreamlike imagery around, essentially superimposed around your bedroom, so to speak. And I think that's what happens in many cases. So now, instead of the old hag here in the United States, a lot of people say, oh, well, it was aliens. So you can imagine if you've had a sleep paralysis experience, then you seek out a UFO investigator back when that was more in vogue, late 80s, 90s, like a Bud Hopkins or a Dave Jacobs, and he hypnotizes you. You go into it with the expectation that maybe you've been abducted, and voila, you confabulate an abduction experience. When I say confabulation, I don't mean that you make it up on purpose. It's where your mind's imagination in a hypnotic state or an altered state fills in details. And I think that can explain a lot. I think my take on the abduction phenomenon, though, Mike, I think, especially when you go back to the 60s, 70s, some of these cases, sleep paralysis, dissociative fugue state, things like that just wouldn't explain a lot of the cases, because you have people taken from their cars. 10 to 20% of the cases are multi-witness cases, the one I mentioned earlier. You have 2 or 3 or 4 different people that this happened to simultaneously. You're not going to have 2 or 3 or 4 people go into sleep paralysis at the same time and hallucinate the same imagery. So I think that some of these people are having authentic experiences. I believe Betty and Barney Hill, who put the experience on the map, I believe they had such an experience. I talk about them in my book, and obviously the Casey County, Kentucky case. I'm not saying they're extraterrestrials, and I don't think they're interested in literally abducting people and performing these horrifying procedures on them, but I think they are having some objectively anomalous experience.
Years ago, I picked up this book by Hugh Ross, Kenneth Samples, and Mark Clark, Lights in the Sky and Little Green Men. Had some real interesting stuff in there. Ken Samples is a friend. I like this stuff. He's got, I think, I don't know if it's in this book where he talks about Marian apparitions, but
I think that's
a different one. Okay,
I think that's a different one.
I remember reading about talking to Hugh Ross or reading in his book about this. He doesn't think that UFOs are extraterrestrial beings. He says, if I remember him correctly, he says the physics of what's going on would make it impossible, where you just all of a sudden it goes up and then does a 90-degree boom, boom at super fast speeds. And
Sure.
You just couldn't have living beings that could survive that. Plus, he says, and physically speaking, you just couldn't do that. Boom, boom. He says that sometimes when you see or have accounts, maybe on video, I don't know, of a UFO lifting up off the ground, real quickly, if something like that happened, you would see the vegetation and trees, they would be moving, given the displacement of the air or whatever it was going, fast displacement of the air. But you don't see that. It's like they're not even moving. So he tends to think that they are spiritual beings, probably demons involved, that they are not extraterrestrial. They would be spiritual in nature. What do you think about that? Do you think aliens and UFOs are extraterrestrial? Do you agree with Hugh Ross that the extraterrestrial hypothesis is implausible, or is there another explanation?
I thought the fact that these UFOs seem to defy physics, the kinds of things that Ross mentions, and I've seen elsewhere, I thought that was, at one point, at the start of this research, the strongest argument against it, that they're extraterrestrial, that these are, in fact, some kind of interdimensional or spiritual phenomenon, whether you want to say they're angels, demons, or something else. I thought that was the strongest argument out there against the extraterrestrial hypothesis. I no longer believe that. Other astrophysicists like the aforementioned Jim Lakatsky, Eric Davis, Hal Puthoff, in the recent books, the series that I mentioned by Lakatsky et al., essentially, Skinwalkers at the Pentagon, Initial Revelations, especially Initial Revelations, they talk about the nuts and bolts phenomena a lot. They go to great pains to show how these observables that we see in UFO cases do not necessarily contradict theoretical physics. And I think they make a good case. And what's interesting to me, Mike, is some of the cases that we see in the 1940s and early 1950s, like the UFOs over Washington in 1952, exhibit a lot of the same characteristics as you see in modern times. And I wouldn't think that modern UFO reporters that see these things would necessarily be familiar with the literature from the 1940s and 50s. And you see the same thing. And I think that's an argument in favor of the nuts and bolts aspect of the case. Yeah, so I think there's a competing argument for that. One thing I think Ross does very well, there's a thing called the rare earth hypothesis, where Brown and Greenlee, they were the initial writers on this. They argued that life like ours in the universe would be very rare because they went through about 20 different factors that would have to be in place, like conditions on Earth, conditions relevant to our place in the galaxy, other things like that, having to have an energy source that's just in the right place.
Yep. And
they argue that if life exists inside our galaxy or outside of it, it's very rare. Well, Hugh Ross puts that argument on steroids. I think at last count he has, if I'm not mistaken, 400 different cases. Okay. What I think Ross does well is he shows that life.
Hey, let me throw something in. If I remember, there's an article that was written by 3 other physicists, Dyson, Susskind, and Klaban. It's been years since I read this article, but if I remember the title correctly, it's Disturbing Implications of the Cosmological Constant. And I don't know if these guys are believers or not. They taught at I think MIT and Stanford, and they kind of say the same thing, not necessarily with all these different factors that you're mentioning, but I think they kind of, if I remember it correctly, they kind of conclude in the end, either there's some kind of an external source that created some inconceivable conditions in order that we could have life in the universe, or our understanding of physics are all wrong. And I think the article was written somewhere near the year 2000. Have you heard of that article? Does that sound familiar?
I have not, actually.
Okay.
I'm not sure how I would connect the cosmological constant, at least offhand.
So I don't, the rare earth thing, I don't, I've not read it. I don't know if the authors are Christians or theists, people in intelligent design. But I doubt that so. Dyson, Susskind, and Klaban are.
Agreed. Agreed. Well, I think getting back to Ross, I think what he shows is that life like ours is highly unlikely. So, but when you read about close encounters, you've got life, what people see, and then during the abduction literature, or in the abduction literature, you've got while they're different from us, they're very similar. They might be very diminutive beings that are human-like. It might be humanoid. You got the really thin, the grays, where you have the black wraparound eyes, where the black just fills the entire space with a thin slit for a mouth, vestigial noses, vestigial ears. You might say, well, that's different from ours, but it's also from what human beings look like, but it's also very similar. You know, you got symmetry. That is, if you draw an imaginary line, head to toe, we're the same on both sides. We're bipedal. You've got arms, legs, and so forth. And then you got the so-called Nordics that a lot of people see, which are just very handsome, very beautiful versions of human beings, essentially tall, long blonde hair. So I think the strength of his argument, I think it shows that life like ours is, and I would consider what people see in these close encounters to be I would say it's similar enough to ours that I just don't know if I buy that they could have evolved independently, that there's another planet like ours somewhere. I think if there's going to be life, it's going to be other life. It's going to look very different from what we have.
Okay.
Even to the point where it would almost be unrecognizable. That's what, in a really good book called Evolving the Alien by Jack Cohen and Ian Stewart, they argue that. They argue that we might be looking, for instance, it's a very humorous book. They got a sense of humor. They talk about how we'll be looking at our telescopes and we'll say, well, that's kind of an Earth-like planet, but you probably can't have life on there because there's too much ultraviolet light. Well, meanwhile, there's probably some kind of intelligent life looking back at us, at our planet, and saying, probably not any life on there, but because there's not enough UV light. So they make a pretty good argument that extraterrestrial life exists, but it would look very much different from what humanity is.
Okay. So what do you think is going on in essence? What's going on with these extraterrestrials?
Yeah, I think they're interdimensional beings.
So they're not extraterrestrials, or would they still be called extraterrestrials, ETs?
Correct. I wouldn't call them ETs. I think the extraterrestrial hypothesis is still respectable. I don't know how to deal with the fact that so many of the beings are humanoid or enough like us to where, I struggle with that on the extraterrestrial hypothesis, but I think it's a respectable hypothesis still. I think the balance is on the side of the interdimensional / what I call the occult hypothesis. I treat those as if they're different theories. Spoiler alert here. But I treat them like they're different theories, but my end view is kind of a synthesis of both of those. I don't know how to differentiate it any further. I think they're what we would call entities from the spiritual realm. I would not necessarily say that they're demons. A lot of us Christians, we like to jump to that conclusion. I think that's at best an oversimplification. I don't think it totally works. And I don't know that there could be good and bad. There could be angels and demons, so to speak. But I think there might be other spiritual beings somewhere in between. Maybe even that we're not aware of, maybe something that the Bible doesn't even discuss. That could be the case as well.
Interesting. I remember when I was reading through Plutarch, you have demons show up. It's not everywhere, but you do have them occasionally show up. But they're different. They're almost like apparitions of an actual dead person. The person comes back almost to haunt another. And they're not necessarily bad all the time. That they could be good. So I don't know if it was later on in Christianity when you had demons that become 100% evil. I'm not even sure. I'm not an Old Testament person, but I guess It'd be interesting to know if there's demons in the Old Testament. I
Yeah,
can't think of any right off.
I really like Michael Heiser's work. The late Michael Heiser, I think he talks about the divine council. I don't want to get too far off tangent, but he talks about the Nephilim, Genesis 6, the Watchers, and 1 Enoch, which we talked about earlier. How even the Bible gives us a much more complex hierarchy than just angels and demons. Just to say that they're angels and demons is probably an oversimplification. I think he's somewhere on the right track. And the Islamic version of jinn, some ufologists think that, and that the idea of jinn, D-G-I-N-N, that goes back into Arabia. It goes back into especially Middle Eastern lore, even before Islam, that these are kind of intermediate. They're not necessarily bad or not necessarily good. There's good and bad versions of them. I wonder if that version might be on the right track. But I do think it is from that realm.
It'd be kind of like the demons in the Greco-Roman literature.
Sure, yeah. So a lot of Christians don't like apparitions of the dead either. I agree. I think one has to be very cautious of the occult. I think for us Christians, the Bible's clear on that, to avoid that kind of stuff, seances and things like that. But if people have what we call a reunion apparition, where a deceased loved one appears, and that generally makes recipients feel better. Like Dale Allison in his book on the resurrection, he comes out and says that he had one of those and he felt better. He saw one of his good friends. And it was spontaneous. It wasn't something that was summoned or even asked for. Is that demonic? I don't think so.
So I think I heard you a few minutes ago when you start to talk about this interdimensionality. I think I heard you mention the word occult. When I hear the word occult, I'm thinking Satanism. How did you use that term? If so, what do you mean by it? Or maybe you didn't use it.
I use the word occult just in the sense of what it means, like hidden knowledge. I don't necessarily mean Satanism.
Okay.
That would be I guess, a kind of a darker version of the occult.
All right. So just to be clear then, you think that these UFOs, you tend to think that they are beings from a different dimension that sometimes intersect with our own.
Yes.
Okay. And they're not necessarily good or evil. Some are evil, some are good, but they're not necessarily one or the other.
The totality of the evidence that I've seen, even Mike, a lot of those that cause harm, it seems to be inadvertent. There's a case in Brazil that happened on an island near there called Colares, where people encountered all these UFOs that were rectangular shaped, and they called them chupa chupas, which means sucker, where they would get assaulted by these beings. Even inside their house, they weren't safe. And it would extract blood out of them. They would be anemic. They would have there would be abduction experiences. It ran everybody on this island except for a few people off the island. They just went running for cover, and they appeared just about every night off the Amazon Amazon basin for 2 or 3 months back in 1977. The Chupa Chupas seemed to be overtly hostile.
Wow.
A lot of the other cases of harm could argue. There are other cases where I think it seems to be hostile. You could argue in some cases when we have fighter jets going after them, there are cases of that they're practicing self-defense even. And then there's other cases where the harm, it's hard to tell. It seems to be inadvertent. And then there are the cases where you have healings as well. So it really seems to be a mixed bag. That's why I'm very reticent to come out and say that they're all demonic or malevolent in nature.
So they're you tend to think they're from a different dimension, but they can come into ours and be physical and interact with us in a physical sense.
Yes.
Do Do you see this UFO phenomenon as being compatible with the Christian worldview?
I think it can be. Now, I would be lying if I told you I don't know how to make all the puzzle pieces fit. I'm still trying to figure that out. I don't think I'm going to figure it out, to be honest with you, Mike. But what I struggled with throughout the course of this research is, okay, some of the aspects, like the paranormal fallout, poltergeists, apparitions, leaving behind haunted houses, people seeing cryptids, the kind of stuff that happens on Skinwalker Ranch, for instance, in northeastern Utah, that seems to really suggest what we call a spiritual component. Whether you want to say positive or negative, that's up for debate. Or it's up to a case-by-case basis, I think. But then you got other cases where you've got landing sites, people, we mentioned that some people seem to have been harmed by these things, ionizing radiation. They seem to be interested in our nuclear facilities for some reason. Bob Hastings wrote a book called UFOs and Nukes, where he's talked to, I believe it was over 140 military officers who said that these things appeared with impunity over nuclear bases, and there wasn't anything that we could do to stop them from appearing. You know, there's the overt physical aspect of these things as well. The abductions, some people are literally seen to be lifted off the ground. So in my apparitions research, there were some physical aspects of those as well, but they weren't anything like the UFO phenomenon. So
Okay.
how do you reconcile the two? And I came to the conclusion you can't treat the words spiritual and physical as if they're contradictory. And when you consider that in a biblical context, I'm not sure that a first century Jew or Christian would have understood that distinction that we make, I think, born from Cartesian dualism or substance dualism. I don't know that they would have understood it either. And when you look at some of the biblical data, Mike, it kind of bears out. Let's take a look at the chariot that came down and picked up Elijah, took him to heaven. Well,
Yeah.
and we mentioned the 1897 airships. Well, to a person in the ancient world in Elijah's day, what would a UFO have looked like? Excuse me. Might have looked like a chariot of horses, where the horses are this ethereal substance of light, and yet Elijah, we are told, got in the chariot, was taken to heaven, never to be seen again, or at least until the Mount of Transfiguration, right? So in the New Testament, and you've got other cases like Jesus' resurrection. The best way I can understand that is the ultimate synthesis, hopefully for all of us in the future, of the spiritual meeting the material or the physical.
Yeah, that's a good example.
Yeah, so I don't think, and there are some other examples too. You know, you got Balaam in the Old Testament, Balak, where you got the angel holding the sword that only the donkey could see, and the donkey stops. The implication of that narrative suggesting that if the donkey had kept going, I can't remember which one was Balaam and which one was Balak, but the person riding the donkey would have been stabbed by this sword. And you got Genesis 18. You got the angels, apparently the divine figure that goes and visits Abraham, and just like Jesus eats food, presumably would have left behind leftovers or whatever. Those are very physical beings. So I don't know that it's really contradictory to the biblical data when you think about it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. It does seem to be the case. You know, in 1 Corinthians 15, Paul says it's sown a natural body, it's raised a spiritual body. And over the years, there have been a number of exegetes or theologians who want to understand that as it's sown, the corpse is sown or buried as a physical body and raised in spiritual, that is immaterial body. But that's not what Paul is saying there.
Right.
And then it's like you say, you know, when the resurrection appearances, Jesus can appear and disappear at will. And he's someone who can be touched, who can eat, who can fix breakfast. So yeah, it's physical at times, and at times it's not physical. Final question. You've mentioned Men in Black a few times. What are they exactly?
Men in Black are these mysterious characters that show up usually in the aftermath of a UFO sighting. They don't occur all the time or even most of the times. But a lot of people reported getting visits from government witnesses, ostensibly from government agencies. People show up in black hats, and there's variations on this, but they'll show up, say, in a black hat, black suit, white shirt, black tie, and they'll knock on doors and they'll intimidate witnesses into giving up exotic substances that may have been collected from the site, or intimidating them into not telling anybody about their sighting. And that's interesting from a number of angles, because not only are there evidential MIB cases, I think some are more of a paranormal provenance, but there's definitely some where government witnesses, whether they're from the Air Force or from the CIA or the FBI or whatever, that has definitely occurred. And I think that's intriguing either way, because if they're flesh and blood humans from agencies, that means that you've got the government taking this very seriously. Even after a civilian sees a UFO sighting, they would find it necessary to intimidate witnesses. Or obviously, if they're paranormal manifestations, and I believe that's the case in some instances as well, that's fascinating for a different reason.
Okay. Wow, we've covered a lot in this. You've done a lot of research on this. I appreciate that. You give me some stuff to think about. I know that I read some, I read through this, but there's just so much that I could absorb in the first read. So, wow.
Well, let me give a special shout out, Mike. I appreciate you and Bill, one of our other board members, for really going through both of these books, the material, and giving me some helpful criticisms. And the book is, for whatever the merits of the book, it's better because of the time you spent to go through it and give me some pointers, give me some suggestions.
No, I appreciate it, brother.
Sure.
Yeah, thanks for this work you do. So, folks, again, it's called The Metaphysics of UFOs. That's coming out next month. I think it's July 8th. Is it?
Correct.
You can pre-order it now on Amazon. It will be available in both softcover and Kindle format, right?
That's right. Kindle.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you so much, Jonathan. Appreciate your time. Appreciate all the work that you do. You've definitely given us something to think about.
Thanks, Mike. As always, appreciate you having me on.